If you're electing someone who's got a lot of charisma, force of personality, what you are saying in essence is, I want not just our government to be more like that, I want everything to be more like that, because that's how culturally influential a leader of the free world is.
Welcome to The Stakes. I'm Brad Rourke with the Charles F. Kettering Foundation. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan operating foundation that focuses on advancing and defending inclusive democracy. Today, I'm talking to Kettering Senior Fellow David French. David, thank you for being here.
Brad, thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
As am I. Among other things, David, you're a New York Times columnist, so there is a lot to pick from. But I want to just focus on a couple of recent pieces of yours. Let's start with the first, which is titled, "The Fire of Stupidity Cannot Be Contained."
Vivid title, isn't it? It's very vivid title.
And did you come up with that title, or did the title writers do it
No,
for
I
you?
did not. I did not. If you read a title, there's about a 90% chance I did not come up with it.
Yeah. In that piece, you walk through a number of old bad ideas that seem to be coming back. In fact, you call them wretched. What are they? What's going on here? What's the argument you're making in that piece?
I mean, so many. Let's just sort of talk about them, not in order of severity, but just sort of like, I'm just throwing them out there. So we have our tariff regime, right? This is something that I grew up in this, I'm a child of the 80s, born in 69, came of age politically in the 80s. If there was anything that was received conventional wisdom, it's like tariffs are an economic drag on, they're a drag on the economy. So you got tariffs, you've got the spoils system, sort of this hiring and firing public servants at will, political patronage. You've got the right wing flirting with fascism. You have 34% of young people, or roughly around 30-something%, having favorable views of communism. You have anti-Semitism rising in this country to an extent where hate crimes against Jewish Americans have just spiked. You have a land war in Europe, for crying out loud. You have people questioning the existence of and necessity of our Western alliance. By and large, we're talking about a lot of early to mid 20th century stupidity just playing out on the world stage and on the domestic stage. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight was not just that we're going through a lot of bad ideas, but these bad ideas aren't even that old. They're not even that old. They're some of the bad ideas that we should be the most inoculated against, but we're not.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask, what do you think is different?
So I would put it this way, and this is just a universal reality of human beings, and you have to know it, you have to acknowledge it, and you have to fight against it, or you'll be a prisoner to it. And that this universal reality of human beings is we are more impacted by our experiences than sort of our intellectual education. So that if we go through something, it sticks. If we learn about something, then it's harder to really fully absorb compared to, and this is total common sense. And so how does this apply to the present moment? The greatest generation is dying out. We now have 0 world leaders who really were old enough to remember World War II. Trump is 80, which means he's born in 1946. And so he was born after World War II, right? And so here you have this world in which people have not experienced all of these terrible things. Communism, the Soviet Union fell 2 generations ago. The fascism, German fascism ended in 1945. Italian fascism ended shortly before that. I mean, you could go through a lot of these terrible ideas. Very few people are alive today who remember what a world war is like, for example. And so you can go through terrible thing after terrible thing after terrible thing, and you realize that fewer and fewer and fewer people are alive today who've experienced these terrible things. But everybody walking around knows liberal democracy in America, and they know its frustrations. They know its dysfunctions, and we are living in a particularly dysfunctional time for liberal democracy. There's a lot of reasons why institutional trust has collapsed. So in that circumstance, unless somebody has a firewall of education that these alternatives are worse, you might have some people kind of turning their heads a little bit and say, well, we need a little bit more authority. We need a little bit more order. We need all of there are reasons why people were drawn to fascism and communism in the past. Those reasons exist today, and we have far less experience enabling us to resist that. And I think no society has figured this out perfectly well. No, it's just very hard. You go through history and you have periods of forgetting and repeating the mistakes time and time again. But we can do better than we're doing. And that's just where we are. And that means that there's a giant void of education. And when you combine it with a void of experience, we're in trouble.
Another recent piece, I just want to shift gears here, that you wrote is about what you call the terrible man theory of history, where you're intentionally encountering the so-called great man theory, in which great events are driven by great people, and great not meaning fantastic, but meaning consequential. But when you're talking about the terrible man theory, what are you saying that's different?
Yeah, so I'm fascinated by this question. If you're going back and you're looking at, say, World War II or the Civil War, how much was history influenced by people, individuals, and how much was it influenced by culture and sort of the tidal systems of life? And I used to put much more emphasis on systems than individuals. I used to be very skeptical of this so-called great man theory of history. But with the rise of Donald Trump and the effect, the very tangible effect I have seen that he has had on the character of the people around me, on the movements that I've belonged to my entire life, on the church that I belonged to my entire life, I'm now revising my view. And that, in essence, the way I would, and when you talk about great man theory of history, and I did call it the terrible man theory of history, because the term great man tends to make people think good, great is good. No, great is impactful. So Hitler was a great man in the sense that he was impactful, but evil. Churchill in this theory is a great man because he's impactful, but he was good. So essentially, here's the way I put it. The quote unquote great man, or in this case, when talking about, say, Hitler, or, in this, and I don't like to say Hitler and Trump are the same sentence, but they're not the same. But when I'm talking about Trump, I'm not talking about great and good. I'm talking about great and bad. And that is that, yes, the quote unquote great man is a product of their culture, but then once they achieve power, they're a product of their culture and time. I mean, I don't think that Hitler could arise without the combination of the extreme upheaval following World War I, combined with the centuries of German militarism, especially Prussian militarism, which meant that Germany was always sort of this latent, especially in that time period, this latent military power, so that it has this military culture that Hitler could commandeer and everything. And so, yeah, he's a product of German history and European history. And other times he would not emerge in the same way. But once he did, he shifted the tides of history. Similarly, you have in Britain, you have Winston Churchill and Neville Chamberlain, two very different men. They're both products of British culture, but they were both shifted the path of history in very different ways. Neville Chamberlain with his appeasement, Winston Churchill with his defiance. Pivotal, absolutely pivotal. And so the way I look at Trump is very similar. He has arisen from a particular time in culture, American culture, that sort of our love of spectacle and WWE style, over the top kinds of confrontations and things like that. He came up at a time where people were desensitized to the sort of carnival barker culture and also very angry at each other. But then when he got into power, he achieved a kind of cultural influence far above and beyond even that, to the point where, as I say in the piece, even the institutions I know well, like the evangelical church, they've become more like Trump. over the last 10 years. Trump has had a cultural impact on the evangelical church that you can see every day. Every day. Public figures in the church are more like Trump now. Rank and file folks in the church are more like Trump now. That's how influential he's been. So he rose out of a time and a place, but then he put his own stamp on it in a very dramatic way. And so that's why, and this is, I beg people, when you're talking about leadership, remember that character is destiny. And that whatever, especially if you're electing someone who's got a lot of charisma, a lot of force of personality, what you are saying in essence is, I want not just our government to be more like that, I want everything to be more like that, because that's how culturally influential a leader of the free world is.
How optimistic are you that we might find someone who could reverse the direction in as consequential a way as Donald Trump appears to have?
I'm actually pretty optimistic about that. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion by any stretch, but I am actually relatively optimistic, and I'll tell you why. American politics is known for what are called thermostatic reactions. And so American politics is called thermostatic, and then in the sense that it's always swinging back and forth. If one administration goes too far to the right, bam, the American electric says too far. Now, the problem is we often swing too much in the other, so we end up with the big swings. So that's why we've been in this cycle of extremism in a lot of ways. However, thermostatic reactions don't always have to be ideological, like right, left. You could have decent versus indecent, for example. And I'll give you a really good example. In 1974, Richard Nixon resigns. A lot of people have forgotten this, that the dude was really corrupt. If you're talking about Watergate, the Watergate break-in, that's really the tip of the iceberg. This guy was super corrupt. He was also very imperial. In a lot of ways, he was a prototype of the Trump imperial presidency. So he had an imperial presidency and a corrupt presidency all at once. Sound familiar? And so what ended up happening? So Gerald Ford becomes president. He's not elected. He inherits the presidency after Nixon resigns. But in the very first election after Nixon is gone is 1976. And it wasn't just that it swung from Republican to Democrat. It swung from imperialism to, I'm not going to say populism, but from imperialism to humility. Like Carter famously walked on his inaugural parade. He did not play Hail to the Chief, for example. He did not like all the trappings of the imperial presidency. And then you went from dishonesty, this very crooked politician, to honesty, a Baptist Sunday school teacher. And one of the interesting things that you're seeing in the primary elections and the general elections heading into November is how much are voters going to actually reward decency as an independent value, separate from ideology. And I think an interesting test case of this is going to be Texas and James Tallarico, because there you have a very indecent, corrupt politician taking on a politician who's very much to his left, but has a reputation for decency and integrity. So how many people will say, I might not agree with Tallarico on everything, but we crave decency. We crave some integrity here, and I'm going to intentionally vote towards decency and integrity. And I'm going to be very interested in how all of that plays out, because I don't think we're getting through this moment, to be honest, unless we can return to decency, integrity. And so I have hope that, however, that people will swing towards decency. I fear that the thermostatic reaction would be as hard as the right has hit you, the left needs to hit back just as hard. And if we get into that kind of cycle, then we're lost.
New York Times columnist and Charles F. Kettering Foundation Senior Fellow David French, thank you for being with us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.